first question, and it's a question that I get often, and Alex, I think you would be very great in answering this. The question is this: how do we, as lay people in the church, equip children to be resilient from the quote-unquote education they're being taught at their school?
That's a very good question, and unfortunately there's not really a good answer to that question. I would say that if you send your child to be discipled for 5 days a week for 8 hours a day and then try to unbrainwash them for 30 minutes per day at dinner, you're going to have a very difficult time doing that. My latest book is called Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, and what I did was I traced the history of how it came to be that the government took over education. People don't realize that that is a new phenomenon. For almost 2,000 years of church history, parents were in charge of educating their children. That's what the Bible teaches. Parents are responsible for the education of their children. The idea that government should take over that responsibility is a very new phenomenon. And so I traced the history of that. It starts with a guy who hated God, hated the Bible, was talking to dead people. His name was Robert Owens. He set up a communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony. And a whistleblower who broke away from his organization and exposed what they were doing. His name was Orestes Brownson. He said the great object of this plan to have the government take over education was to get rid of Christianity. And you look at how that progressed. It took root in Prussia, came back to the United States via Massachusetts through a guy called Horace Mann, another guy who rejected the faith, rejected even the basic tenets of a biblical worldview. He believed people were basically good, that if we could have the government educate kids, we'd get rid of the crime that we had in the world. Massive quackery. Then you had John Dewey, a guy who admired the Soviet Union and studied their system, became the most significant person within the public school system in America. The whole history of how the government came to take over education, not just in the United States, but around the world, is dominated by people who hated God, by people who in many cases were involved in the occult. And then we act surprised that when our children are being discipled by this system, they abandon the faith. The data we have shows that about 80% of Christian children who go through 12 years of government school today will leave the faith, will leave the church, and will go off and do their own thing. So I don't know that there is a way to truly protect your children other than pulling them out of the system and discipling them, and as Ephesians 6:4 says, in the fear, discipline, nurture, and admonition of the Lord, as God told his people in Deuteronomy chapter 6, chapter 11, you teach them about God and his laws when you wake up in the morning, when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting down to eat, when you're going to bed at night. For those few people who absolutely cannot remove their children from the system because of a court order or whatever, and there are some, I tell them, you have to teach your children apologetics. Your kids have to know the stuff better than the teacher and better than the other kids. They need to read Darwin's Origin of Species and find out why it's such a fraud. They need to read Das Kapital by Karl Marx and find out why it's such a fraud and compare it to the biblical worldview. And so you need to anticipate the lies that Satan will try to teach to your child, prepare them with a proper response to that. But ultimately, this is an issue of discipleship, and that falls on parents. So hugely significant question. I do believe that's one of the reasons we're seeing the fruit that we're seeing today, is that we've been unfaithful in disciplining and discipling our children. But I wish there was a better answer. I just don't know of one.
And I think you're dead on, because so often in the last number of years, parents have relegated discipleship to the church, and with the different silos in the church, we're just going to let the youth pastor take care of that because they're the expert. The truth is, the impetus is on the parents. Throughout the scriptures, we are called to disciple our children. That means have intentional relationships, intentional conversations about God, his word, and the heresies and the evil that is out in the world that wants to destroy them.
Yeah, real quick. I had a teacher come up to me after we were at a church, I believe it was in Missouri, and she said, you know what, I will not teach children what the public school system wants to. So I went around to my neighborhood and I said, hey, I'll homeschool your children. And so she started out with like 4 or 5. She's up to like 16, and these parents pay her to teach their children, and it's working out fabulously. So if you're out there, if you're a teacher, and that's something you want to do, you don't want to teach this indoctrination to these kids, maybe that's something you might want to look into.
Well, that's what parents did in ancient times. They had resources, they would go find scholars and so forth, and they'd bring them into their homes, and that's how their children were educated. Yep. This is not a new idea. In fact, the Communist Manifesto makes it really clear. Public education is critical to bring about a communist Marxist conclusion. And so we shouldn't be surprised. But I just want to respond one thing to that, Josh, and that is this. parenting is not a hobby. It's a calling from God.
Yes.
Oh, we're going to have a baby. It's going to be so cute. We're going to live happily ever after. You're just getting a little sinner in your house. And all they do is, cry and poop and are selfish. Right? And then they grow up and you potty train them, but they're still right? I'm just telling you. It's a calling from God. It's not a hobby. Listen, marriage is not a hobby. Oh, I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a husband and it's not ladies, it's not a hobby. It's a calling to be a wife. Guys, listen, it's a calling to be a husband. And I think that's one of the reasons we're in the mess.
Yeah.
Right? Because I see it as a hobby, so I don't want to be bothered. So, fix my wife, fix my husband, fix my kids, fix everything because I just want to have a hobby. And if it doesn't work out, I'm just going to divorce all of you and leave you. And that's exactly what we see happening all across the sectors of our country. So anyways, Josh, here's one. I want you to respond first to this. It says, after the 7-year tribulation, when Jesus returns, we will come with him and reign for 1,000 years. Where will we be living?
That's a great question. And the answer is here on the earth with Jesus as he rules and reigns for those 1,000 years.
All right, there you go. Okay. Josh, you got one more for us, and then we're going to...
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple on here, and we will, Lord willing, next week cover some of these. But here's a great question that's probably in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. Trump doesn't want to take revenge against his enemies, but should he be putting these people on trial, like those who are doing treasonous acts, etc.?
I think it's a very simple answer. The Bible says evil needs to be punished. If you don't punish evil, you're going to get more of it. And what's going on here, these weren't just personal attacks against Trump. I mean, this isn't about like policy disagreements. These were, in many cases, treasonous activities going back generations, whether you're talking about funding jihadist terrorist groups, knowing that you're doing that, whether you're talking about trying to prosecute people on phony charges so that they don't get back into power. These are criminal acts, and if you don't deal with it, you're throwing justice out the window, which of course God absolutely forbids. God is very serious about justice, as we'll all see one of these days here, probably pretty soon. And so I don't think it's about vengeance. It's about justice. If you're going to punish evil, you need to punish evil equally. And it's not about what they did to Trump per se. It's about the criminal acts that they perpetrated. And I absolutely think they should be put on trial. And I think we can do immunity deals. If you're willing to testify, who paid you to do that? Maybe we'll get you some immunity. But I think it's essential that we see justice.
Well, yeah, you had 51. You had 51 former intel agents lie. They lied about what they said. This is just disinformation. This is Russian disinformation. Well, that was a lie. They should all be prosecuted. I mean, you can go you have a laptop that has a treasure trove of evidence that indicts a former president and his entire family. Where is that? That needs to come out. These people need to be tried and prosecuted.
Ken, you've done a lot of investigation and stuff. Let me ask you, is there probably investigations happening right now that we don't know about?
I pray there is, because like Alex said, people need to go to jail for what they did. This is felonies committed on at the highest level by the highest people in authority, and they need to go to jail.
Yeah.